Welcome to the Bulwark Podcast. We've made it to the weekend, and I'm just looking at my Twitter feed, and Bill Kristol is tweeting out that he's about to do this podcast, and he absolutely does not want to talk about Jeffrey Toobin and Jeffrey Toobin's extremely awkward return to CNN. So I'm going to have to do this on my own, Bill. Is that right?
Yeah, that's fine, Charlie. And if you want to take 10, 15 minutes right now, give us your deep thoughts, ruminations, and reflections on that matter, I'll just be quiet here.
All I can say is that I always sort of keep a mental list of like things you can come back from and things you can't come back from. And I think probably this would have been on near the top of my list of if this ever happened to you, which of course is not possible. Would you be able to return to cable television at some point? I mean, also make a list of the most embarrassing things that you could possibly experience. See, I guess my take on this is if you did what Jeffrey Toobin did, I don't know how you'd go to the grocery store, much less go back on television. Okay, so I'm done with this. Hey, Bill, thank you so much for all of the television recommendations. We have worked our way through Broadchurch, Hinterlands, and Shetland. But I have to tell you, and I haven't gotten to the French police drama, but I have to tell you that I am totally immersed in this British police show called The Line of Duty.
Yeah, we have not looked at that yet. So that's okay. I'll put that at the top of my list. Okay.
It is amazing. The other night I was watching one of the season enders, and I actually pressed pause on it and to go pour myself another drink and to reflect on how incredibly good it was.
Oh, great. Okay, that's really good. That's good to know. The only other one I really recommend is Scott and Bailey, which is two women who are in charge of a detective squad in Manchester, and it's got it's lively and a little more like Law and Order, a little less intense than Hinterland or Broadchurch, but good.
No, Line of Duty is very intense. I just have to warn people, it is extremely intense. It's at the far edge. So my wife doesn't watch that. She was able to take the Broadchurch, Hinterland, and Shetland, but I think that crossed line. There's another actual series that I've sort of dipped my toe into that I'm surprised. Very, very unusual. It's called Vera.
Yeah, so Susan has read those books, and we've seen a few of those. She's an interesting character, right?
Oh, she's a total mess.
Yeah.
The detective is a completely dysfunctional woman who is sort of fascinating because it is a little bit like watching a car crash. Okay, so where should we start this morning? We have Joe Biden in Europe, and
he's in Britain, Charlie. So maybe he's watching. Right. He's like, I feel like he should be visiting the scenes, visiting the places where these different crime dramas are set. That's what, if I were president, frankly, I'd be visiting, where Hinterland is set, where Vera is set, where Shetland is set. But he, unfortunately, is just doing his job and meeting with other world leaders.
Sort of get the, getting himself in the mode to meet with Vladimir Putin. And of course, this leads to all sorts of flashbacks to when Donald Trump met with Vladimir Putin and sided with Putin over our intelligence agencies. Really, one of the extraordinary moments of the Trump presidency. And I see that Trump has issued a statement from Mar-a-Lago where he basically says he still trusts Vladimir Putin. I mean, it's like nothing ever changes. Obviously, Donald Trump and his bromance with Vladimir Putin hasn't changed.
Yeah, I mean, it was a gift to Biden in a sense, because people like me were worried about and somewhat critical maybe of the decision to meet with Putin, or at least worried about how that's going to go. And it overshadows the rest of the trip, which would be a good story, I think, about alliance building and so forth. And if Biden's not tough enough with Putin, that's bad. And if Biden's very tough with Putin and they have a discordant meeting in a way, that's not great. Maybe, I don't mind it, but it won't play well. So Trump has sort of taken Biden off the hook a little bit by reminding us of how that appalling day in Helsinki, which, I mean, is a very low bar for Biden to surpass.
I don't want to get into whataboutism. I'm going to try to avoid this, but earlier in the week we had this controversy about the tweet by Ilhan Omar, where she appeared to be drawing a moral equivalency between Israel and Hamas, the United States and the Taliban, and that they've all committed crimes and everybody needs to be held accountable. And what was interesting about it, of course, was that even Democrats pushed back against her comments. That look, we have some problems in our past, but to equate us with the Taliban is just it's not just offensive; it's historically inaccurate. And she has kind of walked back that moral equivalency.
Yeah, I mean,
your thoughts?
No, I mean, it wasn't just some Democrats, but the leadership of the House, the entire leadership issued a statement strongly not just disassociating themselves from Ilhan Omar, but really criticizing her for what she had said. Now, you could have been even stronger, I suppose. But so I think it both reinforces the problem, if I can put it that way, of the left wing of the Democratic Party. That left wing exists. It's got some members in Congress. It sees a moral equivalence, apparently, or something like a moral equivalence, I would say, between what our soldiers do and what Taliban and Al Qaeda terrorists do, and what Israel does and what Hamas does. Having said that, it is a small slice right now of the Congressional Democratic Party. It's got some sympathizers who are in the kind of on the slightly bigger slice, I would say, or apologists maybe for that, rationalizers for that point of view. But again, what strikes me is that everyone repudiated it. Everyone's in the leadership on both sides, in both houses of the Democratic side, repudiated it. It doesn't obviously speak. I mean, she asked this, incidentally, this was a criticism of the Biden administration, if you think about it, right? She was asking a question to Secretary of State Blinken. So she doesn't like the fact that the Democratic administration doesn't have her point of view. So for me at least, it's a reminder that there are sane and reasonable Democrats, and then they have a wing of their party they have to deal with too.
So let's put this in a little bit of context because, going back historically, this was one of the things that really offended, I think, in general, offended conservatives, Republicans, about the folks on the left who might have engaged in moral equivalency between the United States and the Soviet Union, which is also one of the reasons why it was so profoundly offensive and shocking to hear this kind of moral equivalency from Donald Trump when it came to Vladimir Putin. This remained. Let me play a soundbite from his conversation with Bill O'Reilly. This still ranks as one of the most shocking moments of the Trump presidency. Let's play that.
Do you respect Putin?
I do respect him.
Do you? Why?
I respect a lot of people, but that doesn't mean I'm going to get along with him. He's a leader of his country. I say it's better to get along with Russia than not. Will I get along with him? I have no idea. It's very
He's a
possible
killer,
I
though.
won't.
Putin's a killer.
A lot of killers. We got a lot of killers. Why, you think our country's so innocent?
Bill, honestly, whatever you think of other presidents, no other president of the United States ever would have said something like that.
No, and it did. It was interesting. That did. Some people broke from Trump at that point. Joe Walsh, who ended up running in 2020, would have been a Tea Party congressman. It had been not pro-Trump, but sort of a defender of Trump as the lesser of two evils. Really broke at that moment in Helsinki, and people like Liz Cheney, who then still went along with Trump on other things for the next 2 years, were very strong in their criticism. So I think Helsinki was a moment. I wish many, many, many more people had broken, but it was a moment where one really saw the extent of Trump's total moral relativism and amorality, really is the better way to put it, and total lack of appreciation for or belief in any kind of us holding ourselves to higher standards. It was a prelude in a way to the pardoning of the war criminals and so many other things that Trump did. Again, I'd say the Democrats have an Ilhan Omar problem, but the Republicans have a Donald Trump problem. And one of them is the former president of the United States and the leader of that party. And Ilhan Omar is a fringe member of Congress.
So let's talk about some of the things that breaking news here. The New York Times had this kind of blockbuster piece dropped last night or early this morning with 4 different bylines. So you know that it's important. And this is the story that as the Justice Department investigated who was behind the leaks of classified information early in the Trump administration, it took a highly unusual step. Prosecutors subpoenaed Apple for data from the accounts of at least 2 Democrats on the House Intelligence Committee, AIDS and family members. One was a minor. All told, the records of at least a dozen people tied to the committee were seized in 2017 and early 2018, including those of Representative Adam Schiff of California, then the panel's top Democrat, and now its chairman, according to committee officials. So your thoughts? We knew that the Justice Department was aggressive, But to go after members of Congress, wow, this is really quite a story, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it is. And I mean, this, you'd have to really know details and who signed off on what. And did they get, I guess there was no court approval for this, but what was at least the notional justification? There would be internal, presumably, Justice Department documents. It's why it would be good to have either some form of really a look back into what Trump did. And maybe if the Biden administration doesn't want to do it itself, I can sort of see that. Looks like you're just, going after your predecessor. But Congress should do something, or if not, maybe Congress should appoint, even if it's only the Democrats doing the appointing, a respected, group of former judges and so forth with some Republican appointees on it to look at some key elements of Trump's abuse of law. I do think we need to have some clarity about this. I don't know that we want Merrick Garland ordering the Justice Department to look into, what the previous administration did, but there needs to be cooperation, at least with some kind of independent effort, either from Congress or maybe better sort of sanctioned by Congress. So it'll be sort of like the January 6th commission, but I don't know if Republicans would go along with it. But if not, Democrats can appoint it, or it could almost be appointed informally. Or Garland, I suppose, as AG, could say, hey, two former judges, why don't you lead an effort? I'm going to not involve myself in this, and we're not going to have any politicization of it, but why don't you involve an effort we'll cooperate with it in terms of making documents available as appropriate to find out what really happened.
The other story that really is haunting is this deep dive by Reuters, an investigative report from Reuters that Trump-inspired death threats are terrorizing election workers, that election officials and their families are living with threats of hanging, firing squads, torture, and bomb blasts. The campaign of fear sparked by Trump's voter fraud falsehoods threatens the U.S. electoral system. And it starts off with a story about the wife of Brad Raffensperger, the Secretary of State in Georgia, and her name is Tricia. Late on the night of April 24th, by the way, keep in mind that date. This is April. This is long after the election is completely over and Joe Biden has been sworn in, et cetera. Late on the night of April 24th, the wife of Georgia's top election official got a chilling text message. You and your family will be killed very slowly. A week earlier, Tricia Raffensperger had received another anonymous text. We plan for the death of you and your family every day. That followed an April 5th text warning. A family member, the texter told her, was, quote, going to have a very unfortunate incident. And Reuters goes on, those messages, which have not been previously reported, illustrate the continuing barrage of threats and intimidation against election officials and their families months after former President Donald Trump's November election defeat. And, how this has created this atmosphere in which people involved with the elections are looking over their shoulders. Look, I every once in a while, I know I get some pushback. People say, Charlie, you and people like Bill Kristol and Tim Miller, you're being alarmist about the ongoing threat of political violence. But this is very, very real. And my sense is that it continues to build. Your thoughts?
Well, I think your newsletter this morning was excellent on this. I mean, these sort of quote intellectuals who cavalierly talk about we might have to use violence. People might have to use their weapons because when you lose faith in the electoral system, what's left? I mean, these cavalier comments by various types on various websites and in various magazines, can produce real violence and have produced real violence in the past. And we're very familiar with this process of not just radicalization, but genuine, I don't know what the equivalent of radicalization is, violentization or something of people who are, probably a little unstable or certainly excitable and so forth. So, I think we've all underestimated in a sense how much, unfortunately, kindling there was here in America for people to start throwing matches. But then the willingness to throw matches and the willingness to just, do it cavalierly and irresponsibly without any seriousness about what might be the consequences. This whole Arizona thing, incidentally, is very dangerous and damaging. Very. And they're all just going, I mean, there are people who are flying out there to look at it and stuff, and then others who are just sort of sanctioning it, and most of the others who were just not saying a word about it, including the governor of Arizona. I was on a call yesterday, so he didn't say this, but I'm going to say this with the, I can't remember his title, the auditor, election commissioner, whatever he is, in Arizona, who got elected actually in November and took over and said, look, I've looked at this and this was a fair election. He's a Republican, quite a strong Republican, quite a conservative Republican. And he And he's himself had some threats, incidentally, with his family, and others have in Arizona. But he said, but the degree to which they're sort of damaging any kind of faith in the system and laying the predicate for really a terrible path that the Republican Party is going to go down over the next, not just in Arizona, over the next 2-3 years. But again, it might be a little different if the governor of Arizona, the Republican governor of Arizona, who everyone knows is a decent guy and who certified the election and who isn't, a Trump acolyte, Doug Ducey, but he hasn't said a word. I mean, the cowardice of the establishment Republicans enables the incitement, and including the incitement to violence of the extremist Republicans.
Well, this is that whole, argument. Oh, let's just humor them. What could possibly go wrong if you humor them? This Arizona story, I think, is interesting because on one level, it is a clown show. It is a joke. It is ridiculous. And I actually said this on television yesterday. But that doesn't mean that it's not dangerous. And I've used this line over and over again, so I apologize if you've heard me say it. But a clown with a flamethrower is still still has a flamethrower. This is really dangerous because what's going to happen is the cyber ninjas will come out with some sort of a complete bullshit report. It'll come out in the middle of summer. It will then be amplified in this media ecosystem that we've come to understand. So the doom loop of crazy begins. And unfortunately, the people who ought to be pushing back against it will probably, continue to duck and cover. And the big lie will spread. And as far as recently as yesterday, I think representatives of 7 different state legislatures have visited this clown show, have gone to Arizona. So this is not going to be confined to Arizona. This will metastasize, and it will feed this entire narrative that the election was stolen, that the president is not legitimate, that the election needs to be decertified. And yeah, this is dangerous. And up until about 5 minutes ago, we understood how stuff like this would be fundamentally dangerous to American democracy. I mean, forget the impact on the Republican Party. This is an ongoing national problem, and it will feed this climate of violence.
And it will also feed efforts in state legislatures to say, you know what, we have to have the right as legislators to step in and overturn these fake election results that are being reported by corrupt election commissioners and so forth. And then the establishment Republicans will say, well, gee, that's maybe not so wise. Maybe I'll just go along. What damage could it do? Humor them for now. They're not really going to do it in November of 2024. No, I totally agree. We're in a very dangerous cycle here. And again, I'm happy to denounce, God knows, Trump and all of his acolytes and supporters and the totally irresponsible pseudo-intellectuals who encourage and promote these conspiracy theories and encourage violence. But also the establishment Republicans who keep quiet deserve an awful lot of blame here.
Yeah, but it's become a way of life for them. You mentioned my newsletter, and this was something that I've been building up to for a while, but there's a publication called American Greatness, which I think fancies itself as the intellectual home of MAGA world, that it is, people, and unfortunately, there are a lot of pretty well-known conservative writers who vote for it. I mean, who write for it. Dennis Prager writes for it. Victor Davis Hanson, Roger Kimball, Josh Hammer write for this. People like Selena Zito. And it has become more and more radicalized and continues to fetishize political violence. And I wrote about a piece by Daniel Gellertner. Is that how you pronounce the name?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Not to be confused with his father, David, which I did accidentally a couple of weeks ago. So I apologize for that. But Daniel writes this piece, Why I Need an AR-15. And I know that there are some people who say you should ignore this, you shouldn't amplify it. I said, no, we need to understand that this is festering out there in the pseudo-intellectual, wing of MAGA world, and they're normalizing it. So he writes about why I need an AR-15, and he writes, the current administration in Washington, D.C. is not elected and is not legitimate. Now, he's writing this in the context of an AR-15. And then he goes on to say an AR-15 is not just a tool of last resort. It is a declaration that the last resort exists, a reminder that there are outer limits to the abuse of power. Now, I know that there are Second Amendment folks out there who believe that the Second Amendment is so that we can overthrow our government or we can fight back against government. I'm a supporter of the Second Amendment, but I've never understood exactly what the scenario was, how people were going to use those guns to fight, let's say, the U.S. Army, which has bigger guns. and tanks and things like that. But this is the question, and I'm glad you brought it up, because now you're seeing these MAGA types who are specifically linking the threat of armed insurrection to the big lie about the election. And, again, he's denying the legitimacy of President Biden and the federal government. And the last resort that he's talking about is armed insurrection. And the AR-15s are not simply for show. So the question I ask is, okay, so if you bring this AR-15, who are you willing to shoot? Really? I mean, can we talk about this? I mean, unless this is just, MAGA masturbation and dress up play, who'd you be willing to kill? Capitol police officers, Secret Service agents, members of the FBI, National Guardsmen, election officials, members of Congress, the vice president, the president. At some point, if you're going to play around with these ideas, people need to say, okay, specifically, what are you talking about? When you bring that gun, do you intend to use it? And who do you intend to use it against?
No, absolutely. And also, what about, it's not as if there's never been right-wing extremist, sort of white supremacist terrorism in the last few years in the United States, often against Latinos at a department store, I think it was, in El Paso, Texas, and so forth. So, it's not as if this never is so fanciful that we're not allowed to worry about it. Quite the contrary. So, and then of course, we're not even mentioning January 6th, really. So, I mean, it is after January 6th, people thought, I guess I even thought, okay, there'll be some retreat from the irresponsibility. They are more irresponsible today than they were before January 6th. I mean, what does that say, though, about the current state of Trumpism and to some degree of some chunk of American conservatism in the Republican Party?
Well, let's also talk about those of us who are politically homeless, who have been politically homeless. And there's been a lot of talk about the red dog Democrats. How do you describe yourself? Do you describe yourself as a red dog? Do you describe yourself as a Biden Democrat? Where are you coming down?
I think I was on TV yesterday, and I think I got slightly. I sort of said Biden Democrat, and I think maybe Jim Tapper said, I can't remember if this was on TV or off the air, but he said, "Aren't you a Biden Republican?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm a Biden Republican, but I'm a Biden Democrat because in Virginia, for example, I'm so disgusted by the Virginia Republicans all catering to Trump, to say the least, in their gubernatorial campaigns, that I voted in the Democratic primary on Tuesday for Terry McAuliffe, who's a moderate Democrat, who's a pretty good governor, and who won easily. So I feel like, okay, I can certainly live with that. So I don't quite know what I am, but I hope Biden is a successful president. And I've got to say, you look at, again, Ilhan Omar is the argument against, quote, joining the Democratic Party, because they're crazy and they're going to go more in that direction. But the repudiation of Ilhan Omar is the argument that, we can live with at least the mainstream of the Democratic Party for now. And the failure to repudiate Donald Trump is the evidence that you can't live with the mainstream of the Republican Party for now.
Yeah, the problem, of course, with that is, there's two problems. Number one, that I'm not sure the Democrats really want us.
Well, that's fine. I mean, of course, that's true. Yeah.
Because we of course come from the swamp of pure evil, and there's no redemption whatsoever. And then, of course, there are the folks who say that you can't possibly make common cause because this administration is so left wing. Can I play you my good friend Ron John, the senior senator from the state of Wisconsin, who was on with with Sean Hannity, meeting of great minds, and listen to how he describes the Biden administration. The word salad he uses. This is Ron John from last night.
Why is he granting these waivers to countries that are not particularly friendly? They're hostile towards us, and meanwhile taking away American jobs simultaneously.
Because he's weak. And, don't ask me to get inside the mind of a liberal, progressive, socialist, Marxist like President Biden. But what I do know is this is self-inflicted.
Okay, so was it liberal, progressive, socialist, Marxist like Joe Biden? There's a lot going on there. There's a lot of political theory being thrown around there, Bill.
Yeah, I don't know that faction. I once knew a little bit about these different Marxist factions from the 30s and 40s, and they each had their own little. There were the Trotskyites and Stalinists, and there were sub factions and other factions, Democratic Socialists, of course, and undemocratic Socialists. But yeah, I wasn't aware of that Joe Biden, when he joined the liberal, progressive, socialist, Marxist faction at the University of Delaware or Syracuse Law School, or when he was a senator beginning in 1972, and being a mainstream Democrat and supporting the crime bill in 1994 and so forth. I mean, yeah, what can you even say? It's just as you say, throwing words that Ron Johnson has the sense are unpopular. And look, what it really does, though, is you get it all in one ridiculous phrase, but it makes liberal and Marxist just on a very next to each other, puts them next to each other, so to speak. And it means that, you can't so say, look, there's a respectable liberal point of view that we want to, as part of the American political spectrum. There's a progressive point of view that I'm less fond of, but that they get to make their case too. Then there's socialists who are not much part of the American political spectrum. Some of them could be decent people, and some not. Some democratic, some not. And then Marxists, a few could be decent, but that's a pretty bad political philosophy and ideology. But no, you can't make any of these normal distinctions that people have made for a century, and it's all just lumped together.
Well, words actually used to mean things. This is the thing that it's hard to sort of catch up with, is that Marxism used to represent a specific ideology. I mean, there were lots of different iterations of it, but it was a thing. And now it's just sort of thrown together like Mad Libs. I mean, you listen to some of this, it's just like you just throw it in, you just Marxist, Black Lives Matter, throw in the word Marxist, critical race theory. So that we're throwing around these terms that if anybody was slow, if you slowed them down and said, okay, could you define Senator Johnson, what does Marxist mean? And can you identify a specifically Marxist policy that Joe Biden is advancing? Let's have that discussion. Or when people talk, I think yesterday somebody was doing a count. Fox News, by the time that I went to bed, I think, which was relatively early, of course, had mentioned critical race theory more than 30 times. I wonder what percentage of the listeners and hosts and commentators could actually define what critical race theory means, except these words are sort of just thrown in as substitutes for bad thing, something I don't like. Now, by the way, this happens on liberal media as well. Things are thrown in, but the term Marxist, liberal, progressive, socialist, Marxist. I mean, it's just sort of like this spew of I'm just going to throw out all the bad words that I can possibly think of, and I know that I'm not going to be challenged on it.
Yeah, no, it's terrible. I mean, critical race theory, you've written about this. I mean, I don't like what I understand to be, the kind of the intellectual core of critical race theory. I don't like and I don't agree with. On the other hand, it's been used so indiscriminately by the right. Now we have legislation banning its teaching that it also would seem to ban, having an honest account of what happened in Tulsa 100 years ago, or having a serious discussion about slavery and its implications, or Reconstruction and what happened, or the Klan in the 20s, or segregation in the 50s and 60s, or continuing discrimination at times today. So the whole, it's become impossible. It's so dumbed down, the right and the conservatives, and in ways that conservatives played a very constructive role in actually distinguishing between, okay, let's end segregation and end discrimination, but let's not become let's not heighten racial sensitivities and identity unnecessarily and in a way that's going to be divisive. That was once a sort of standard conservative talking point, and I think one in good faith. Now it's very hard to make that argument.
Okay, earlier this week, former Congresswoman Barbara Comstock had an op-ed piece in the New York Times where she called on other Republicans, stop cowering before this guy. She's spoken out against Trump in the past, but it was a very, very strong piece, and I know that you had some thoughts about it. Do you sense any movement, any possible green shoots of people who are going, okay, so we're hearing voices like, we've heard Adam Kinzinger. We're hearing Barbara Comstock. We're hearing Denver Riggleman. And these are former congressmen. Is there any appetite for the kinds of things that Barbara Comstock was talking about?
I mean, I think there might be, and I think there are some, as you say, green shoots, and I'll come back to that in a second. But I think I said this on Brian Williams maybe Wednesday night. Barbara Comstock wrote her op-ed the same day Elise Stefanik went to Mar-a-Lago to bend the knee. And of course, Elise Stefanik and Barbara Comstock were colleagues in Congress, and were rather similar, I'd say, in the sense that they were more moderate Republicans. From Barbara's from my district here in Northern Virginia, Elise is from upstate New York. They didn't always vote in lockstep with Trump. They had their problems with Trump in 2017, 2018. Then before that had been for a more forward-looking Republican Party that was a reformist party and so forth. And one of them went one way and one the other, and one of them distanced herself from Trump. It wasn't quite willing to break. That was Barbara. I mean, wasn't willing to say she wouldn't, I don't know, vote for McCarthy for leader or something. And in our district, people just wanted a Democratic House to check Trump, and so she lost. It was not a reflection on her. She's well-liked and respected. Elise went the other way, became a favorite of Trump world, and now she's number 3 in the House. That sort of says it all for me, people, Barbara was ahead of Elise in seniority and stature 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, and now she's out of the House, and Elise is number 3. Which does bring us to Liz Cheney, the person Elise Stefanik replaced as number 3. I mean, she is the one person I really think who's in office, is fighting, didn't either leave like Flake and Corker or lose like Barbara and others. She's not the only one, but she's the main one, certainly the most prominent one she's staying a Republican. She is genuinely conservative, more than either Comstock or Stefanik on policy. And she's going to fight her primary in Wyoming, it appears, and fight if she gets reelected, renominated and reelected, fight in the House for the future, and maybe in 2024 at the presidential level for the future of the Republican Party. I think right now, as she would be the first to acknowledge, she's in a minority in the party as a whole. But, having someone of her stature and intelligence and political savvy fight makes a pretty big difference. For me, that's the big change from 6 months ago.
So, do you have any strong feelings about the infrastructure package and the compromise? We're getting this report last night that 10 Senate Democrats and Republicans say they've reached a 5-year, nearly $1 trillion infrastructure deal. We don't know whether they actually have the votes. We don't know whether that could break a filibuster. But your sense on the Biden administration's efforts to get some kind of an infrastructure should more directly, should Joe Biden accept half a loaf? Should he accept $1 trillion if it's got a lot of new spending, if he could get a handful of Republican votes? Would that be worth it?
I mean, I think it would, without knowing, frankly, a heck of a lot about the details and about which programs will work and which won't, that feels like such, of course, a conversation that one used to have 10 or 20 years ago. Well, can we actually look at this bill? Is this thing, are bridges necessary or are highways necessary? But of course, getting into actual, I don't even mean the weeds. I mean, even the outlines of public policy is so beyond our public debate these days, which is just slap a number and then someone else says, I have a different number, and that number looks too small or too big or something. It's like childish, frankly, but whatever. But anyway, I think it would be good for the country to have some pieces of legislation passed with somewhat bipartisan majorities. I just think that would be healthy for the country. I think it would be good politically for the Biden administration. And yes, I would recommend to Joe Biden that if he could get a police reform bill, which I think they seem pretty close on with some Republican support, and an infrastructure bill, he can come back. And if he holds in 2022, or if he holds Congress in 2023, or if he doesn't hold Congress, he can try in 2023. Get some things with bipartisan support will help him. It'll take the edge off the arguments that it's just a left-wing Democratic administration shoving everything through. And I'd be for taking what you can.
It is interesting that there are, in fact, 5 Democrats and 5 Republicans who've been working together. We keep wondering whether there's sort of a centrist, heart in the United States Senate. And then the names are interesting. Bill Cassidy, Republican from Louisiana, who voted to convict Trump. Susan Collins, Joe Manchin, Lisa Murkowski, Rob Portman, Mitt Romney, Jeanne Shaheen, from a Democrat from New Hampshire, Kirsten Sinema from Arizona, John Tester, Democrat of Montana, Mark Warner, Democrat of Virginia. And apparently this deal calls for about $974 billion in infrastructure spending over 5 years, which comes to about $1.2 trillion when you extrapolate that over 8 years. And it would include about $579 billion in new spending. So my initial gut reaction without knowing all the details is this seems like a really good faith effort. You're moving closer to the number that I think the Biden folks really want. I think they want to have that $1 trillion number, which, as I've said several times, out here in the real world is still a big number. It's still a lot of money. I'm sorry for people saying, no, there's no way that we can give up. Guys, $1 trillion, this is a lot of money. And we've already spent a lot of money. So it feels like we're getting close to it if both sides actually want to get it done. And of course, that's the big question.
And, the Republicans you mentioned, so 4 of the 5, if I'm not mistaken, voted for conviction on impeachment in February. And Rob Portman is retiring. And he also voted for the January 6th commission. Of course, there shouldn't be there needn't be a correlation between how much money you think should be spent on infrastructure programs and whether you voted to convict Donald Trump. No. But it is a sign that if you're not in the camp that was willing to break with Trump, which is basically 7 or 8 senators at this point, it's not clear that you're willing to do anything with the Biden administration. And that's a good, I guess Mitch McConnell has, played Lucy in the football so often that one even hesitates to say this, but, it would be good for the country if Mitch McConnell said, you know what, this is a reasonable deal. I've made deals in the past. This one I'm going to be for. And, that doesn't mean he has to be for all the stuff he hates. And, he can continue to Ron Johnson. He can let Ron Johnson denounce the Biden administration as progressive, was a liberal progressive socialist Marxist.
Liberal progressive socialist Marxist.
It'd be nice if not McConnell himself, maybe some other responsible Republicans. Again, the silences of the establishment Republicans, the Shelbys and the Blunts and the Grassleys and all these characters is pretty astonishing.
See, I think that you're drawing the line between the vote on the impeachment and this is really valid, because I think that what we found was there were at least 7 Republican members of the Senate that were willing to be independent, were willing to break with their party in a very fundamental way. And so that's a signal that they're kind of in play on every issue. So if, in fact, at the end of the day, the Biden administration does not get any of them to support their major legislative initiatives, I think that's a failure, because clearly you have people who are willing to go out on their own and take some political risk, even if they know that it antagonizes the Republican base. That vote was really a defining vote for them, right? Saying, okay, I am willing to do something completely different. Okay, so I'm hearing some word on the street about secret dinners that you've been engaging in. I know that the Red Dog Democrats do not actually, in fact, get invited to Georgetown cocktail parties, but there was some Bill Kristol, Tim Miller sighting in D.C. over the week. Yeah,
Tim was in town for a couple of days, and that's, of course, it was exciting to see people that one used to see quite often when one used to travel routinely. But of course, these days that's not been the case for quite a while. So he showed up in D.C., our colleague Tim Miller, for the first time in, I think, 15 months. And we went out to dinner, which is something I've now done about 4 times, but it's still getting back in the knack of that. With Tim and with Alex and Rachel Vindman. Alex Vindman famously testified and told the truth in 2019
Patriot,
about Ukraine, total patriot. And we'd all gotten to know each other slightly in that episode. None of us had, I think, neither Tim nor I had met the Vindmans before that. And so Susan and I and Tim and Rachel and Alex had a very pleasant dinner. I think there's a photo of Tim and the Vindmans up on Twitter and maybe online. Of course, Susan and I had to, we stay in the background to make the conspiracy look, even vaster and more mysterious, and we
did you take that picture?
I think Susan took that picture. Okay. Right. So, and anyway, it was a very pleasant dinner. And, but again, the degree to which we've normalized everything, as you say, Alex Vindman, true patriot, not a single person has even alleged credibly that he didn't say anything that was utterly true, and that he did it under oath and was asked to testify by Congress, and had served the country and served the Trump National Security Council, despite, I'm sure, not having a high opinion of Donald Trump, because he thought it was the right thing to do for the country, and his bosses had thought well of him in terms of his actual work product on Russia and Ukraine and the issues he was working on, detailed over from the Army to the NSC. So again, no legitimate criticism of it at all. He gets denounced, called a traitor. Remember this? I've seen this on Fox News. Yeah. They get, of course, death threats and so forth. really disgusting. You know, it's interesting. Liz Cheney, I remember this at the time, though she was going to vote not to impeach Trump, which disappointed me, on Ukraine. Remember, she defended Alex Vindman against some of the really disgusting attacks by some of her colleagues in the House, and of course Fox News and all those characters. So it was, but again, that's sort of skated by, and you know, no one has apologized to him. Kevin McCarthy hasn't said, you know, in the heat of the battle there, we said some things that we regret, but we respect people who served in the military and served our country. But no, of course not. No apology, no acknowledgement that of how terribly they behaved under Trump. And of course, they can't do that. They don't want to do that because they're still behaving terribly by accommodating Trump.
Well, and also this is another indication of how we live in this upside down world where you have somebody who has devoted his life to serving his country, who was a patriot, who felt that his obligation to his country meant that he needed to tell the truth to Congress. And yet in the minds of so many people, that becomes an act of treason. And Rachel Vindman has a very active Twitter account where she, you know, if you follow the kind of the response you get, there's still people out there who think that any criticism of Donald Trump himself constitutes treason, which, again, Bill, words used to actually mean things, and we used to understand that putting country ahead of the political ambitions of one person was one of the highest forms of patriotism. And all of that's turned on its head these days.
Yeah. I mean, Vindman, I think Colonel Vindman I'm not sure he even had met Trump maybe more than once or twice. He didn't testify. He testified as to what had happened, what he had seen happen in the National Security Council with Sondland and all that sort of thing. He didn't attack Donald Trump. He didn't, say, oh, it's terrible that Trump told me this, because Trump hadn't told Vindman this. He reported what he saw in the White House. When you're summoned to testify under oath by Congress, you're about a controversial, questionable set of actions, you're supposed to tell the truth. That's what he did. And that's what the Trump people couldn't stand.
Bill Kristol, thank you so much for coming back on the podcast. We always appreciate it.
My pleasure, Charlie.
And thank you all for listening to this weekend's Bulwark Podcast. I'm Charlie Sykes. We will be back on Monday, and we'll do this all over again.